Hi, my name is Wesley Wright, and what I want to do is just give you guys a brief overview as well as a brief presentation on a highly debated, highly controversial topic of cannabis. So throughout the course of the presentation, I'll be going over why cannabis was actually made illegal in the first place. I'll be going into what actually cannabis is, discussing the two most active compounds within it. Towards the end of the video, I'll be giving you a brief overview on some of the medical benefits as well as some of the reported medical drawbacks, discussing my political opinion, and also going over a few case studies of individuals who have been helped by this plant. So like I mentioned, wanted to talk about why it's made illegal. In order to do that, we're going to have to go back to the earlier part of the 20th century. So the earlier part of the 20th century was a time kind of during the Industrial Revolution where people were starting to figure out that they could use this hemp to produce a lot of products. So products such as paper, it was being used in foods, it was being used in textiles, and a number of other different products that were being produced by other means could now be produced by hemp. And right around the 1930s, there was a machine invented called the decorticator, which allowed the hemp fibers to be processed a lot faster. This in turn made hemp's availability a lot more widespread. In turn, what that did also was that it threatened a lot of businesses who were producing products that could be produced by hemp and were being produced by other means. It threatened those businesses and their profits. And so what happened was there was a paper company that was owned by the name of William Randolph Hearst. He owned a paper company as well as the nation's largest publication. And what was going on was that hemp production was starting to threaten his business. He obviously didn't like that too much. And so what he did, since he owned a publication company, was start to release a lot of propaganda about hemp. Now the funny thing is during that time period and during those publications he was releasing, he was kind of throwing around a term called marijuana, and essentially the term marijuana was deemed from a type of wild Mexican tobacco. So it wasn't even used to describe the actual plant, which was cannabis. And the way that he was effectively able to kind of push legislation through and get the word out was that he was saying that this new drug called marijuana was causing blacks as well as Mexicans to essentially rape and sodomize American white women. And so now that I've given you a brief overview on why cannabis was deemed illegal, what I want to do next is discuss what the plant actually is. So like I mentioned, now that you guys have a brief overview on why cannabis was illegal, let's go ahead and talk about the plant itself. And cannabis is essentially just a wild growing weed that does produce flowering buds. And the way that it's consumed is that these buds are then picked off the plant, they are dried and then smoked and consumed. And so cannabis is a plant that has roughly 400 active compounds within it, but the two most active compounds within cannabis are THC as well as CBD. THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, CBD stands for cannabidiol. And the reason that cannabis usage has gotten so popular is because of the compound THC. Reason being is that it's responsible for all of the psychoactive effects that are experienced when consuming cannabis. And some of the reported benefits of using THC are that it can increase a person's mood, it can be a mood uplifter, it can increase a person's creativity, it can decrease a person's anxiety, if a person's experiencing nausea, it can help with that, and it can also increase a person's appetite. Now some of the reported downsides of using THC are that it can actually increase a person's anxiety, it can increase their heart rate, it can decrease their blood pressure, it can give them an increase in this feeling of paranoia, it can also put them into a state of psychosis. But one thing to note with all of these negative downsides is that THC is a compound that reacts with every human being differently. So just because one person's experiencing one set of symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that another person will experience those same symptoms. Now CBD, like I mentioned, is the other active compound, and CBD is a compound that does not produce any sort of psychoactive effects, but it rather produces some of the physical effects. And some of those physical effects have been reported to be that if you are experiencing nausea, it can help you relieve nausea. It's been used for quite a while as far as just general pain relief, so if you have an upset stomach or a backache or headache, it can kind of help out with that. And there's a number of other pain relieving as well as anti-anxiety qualities associated with CBD uses. One thing to note also is that when it comes to the negative side effects of using CBD, there actually haven't been any reported negative side effects of using CBD. So now that I've kind of brought you up to speed on what cannabis is, let's go into some of the more controversial topics surrounding cannabis. One of the great dilemmas surrounding cannabis research is that cannabis is still considered a Schedule 1 substance by the federal government. So what that means for researchers is that it has been increasingly harder for them to actually study the plant. Like I mentioned, they consider it a Schedule 1, so access to funding as well as access to permission from the federal government is pretty hard to come by. So, however, in states that have legalized cannabis, there have been research centers kind of popping up to help kind of circumvent the permission needed by the government to research research cannabis. And so, what's kind of happened is that these research facilities have done clinical trials. They're more specifically trials that are focused on individuals that are suffering from pains that come from certain diseases or certain cancers or illnesses. And one of the studies that I'll go ahead and mention comes from the University of California Center for Medical Cannabis Research. And what they did was that they took a group of individuals who were suffering from neuropathic pain from spinal cord injuries. And what they found was that the group that they gave the placebo to versus the group that they gave the cannabis to, group that they gave the cannabis to saw a 30% reduction in pain. Another study that comes from the NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, saw that in states where cannabis was legal, they saw a drastic decrease in opioid abuse as well as opioid prescriptions. One of the last studies that comes from the University of California Center for Medical Cannabis Research, they specifically were studying individuals that were suffering from pain from HIV. Similar results. Cannabis users versus placebo users, cannabis users saw right around a 32% decrease in pain reduction. And so there have been a number of research reports and research done surrounding cannabis over the past couple of years, and all of it has been overwhelmingly in favor that cannabis does provide some sort of medical benefit. And so with that research said, it's becoming increasingly harder and harder for the federal government to effectively make a case surrounding why cannabis should still remain a Schedule 1 substance. Like I mentioned, I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview on my political opinion. And what I want to do is just throw out a statistic out there for you. And that statistic is that there have been roughly zero reported deaths from cannabis consumption in comparison to 400,000 deaths a year for alcohol, 480,000 for tobacco, and 47,000 for other drug consumption related deaths, which is a pretty staggering statistic. And the next bit to my political opinion is that the reason why cannabis is still illegal, I think, comes down to three specific industries. It's the tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the privatized prison industry. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into that, so it'll definitely be a topic that you'll have to kind of research and discuss on your own. But when you start to dig beneath the surface, you can see why all three of these industries have a lot to gain and a lot to preserve from keeping this plant to becoming legal. Some other things to consider is that there have been places around the world who have decided to go ahead and decriminalize it or make it legal. These countries have reported, or states have reported, an increase in economic growth, decrease in crime, increase in social activity, quite a number of other reported benefits. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the reported medical benefits associated with cannabis use. Like I mentioned previously in the video, there's quite a number of reported medical benefits. It's helped people decrease people's anxiety. It's helped with physical ailments as well as mental ailments. So I want to thank you guys for watching my presentation. Hope you guys learned something.